Arts and Humanities intern. I work for the City of Takoma Park. And today's event is one of the few events that we host for We Are Takoma. And you can check out more of our events by either visiting our Facebook page or by visiting our City of Takoma Park website. And feel free to also grab a brochure outside or sign up for our e-newsletter. Everything's outside in the desk, outside. And now I will introduce you to Pat Henrahan.
Thank you very much for being here. It's nice to see a good crowd. And I just wanted to say a few things. Put it up closer. Okay. Oh, now I can tell. So I'm here on behalf of the Friends of the Takoma Park, Maryland Library. Sorry. It's bad this doesn't work. But anyway, I'm here on behalf of the Friends of the Takoma Park, Maryland Library. And I don't know, I think many of you are familiar with the Friends of the Library, but for those of you who aren't, we have memberships, and the members give us a donation. It's a sliding scale, and that supports our activities, which are all benefiting the library. We also have a book sale 3 times a year, and in fact, we're having one on Saturday in the community center, in the game room where the pool tables are, so please stop by. And the money we make from the book sales also help the library. And the things we do for the library, we pay for books, we pay for some things like tables and chairs for the children's room. We also pay for programs like the costs involved in this, adult programs, and we pay for the circle times for kids, you know, maybe the Spanish circle times, the French circle times, the English circle times, Summer Quest, Winter Quest, and a variety of other programs for little kids and teens. And tonight we have over on the table, and there may be some outside too, a form for the Friends of the Library, which I hope you'll take if you're not a member, fill out and join. And on the other side are bios of each of the speakers, Jeremy Duru, Ethelbert Miller, and Ralph Steinhardt. We also have, thanks to the library, a 2-sided list of books for adults and children, of books that are in the library and on the topics you'll hear about tonight. So please take some, take one, take more, and take advantage of the library. So I'd like to introduce briefly the speakers because there's a longer bio over there. But Ethelbert Miller is a poet with a passion for baseball. He's a poet who is engaged in the struggle for political and racial justice. He has a connection to Takoma Park that's pretty deep. He worked for a number of years with Marcus Raskin, Jamie Raskin's dad, at the Institute for Policy Studies. And he has been as a member of the board of IPS. His recent book is a book of poetry called If God Invented Baseball. It's in the library, and I hope you'll pick it up and look at it. It's a wry, sometimes humorous, and often philosophic comparison of life with America's favorite pastime. And Ethelbert has been rightly called one of America's great poets, so we're delighted to have him here with us tonight. Jeremy Duru, who's right next to me here, is someone I've known for a long time. He's a friend of my kids. He grew up in Takoma Park. Mary Duru, who's not here yet, but some of you may know, is his mom. And if you ever wondered what happens to all those kids who play football in front of the library, tearing up the lawn, this is what happens to them. They become someone like Jeremy, who becomes one of the foremost sports authorities in the country, writing about football. Jeremy's book, if I can find my page, yes. His book, which is called Advancing the Ball, is about the Rooney Rule and how it came about. He is also the only speaker on the platform tonight, I think, who's been in a Spike Lee movie. And Ralph Steinhardt, who lives in Takoma Park and is a professor at GW as International Human Rights Law professor, is also interested in sports and brings an interest in international sports to the podium tonight, or to the group. He also is a great musician. If you ever had a chance to hear him play, he's a terrific pianist. I've heard his jazz music, and it's wonderful. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. Thank you for coming. Pick up your forms, your papers, especially for the Friends of the Takoma Park Library. Thanks a lot. And I guess, do I hand this?
I'm not sure we need it.
Okay. So Ralph, the moderator, I'll give it to him.
We've been wired, so perhaps you can hear us.
Yeah, we've got mics.
Can you hear us? So good evening, everybody. I want to begin by thanking the Friends of the Takoma Park, Maryland Library, and of course the City of Takoma Park for sponsoring this event. It's always dangerous to single out particular people for thanks, but I have to acknowledge the special role of Meryl Leffler and Pat Henrahan from the FTPML, and Brendan Smith, who is the Arts and Humanities Coordinator for the City of Takoma Park. They had the vision, they had the energy to make this event a reality tonight. The second most important thing I can do is to ask you all to silence your phones so that it doesn't interfere with the great thoughts that are about to emanate from this stage. I'm told that this event suggested itself to the organizers when President Trump started criticizing Colin Kaepernick and other NFL players who kneeled during the national anthem. The starting point was essentially a question of what rights of protest athletes have as a matter of law, but also as a matter of culture. I suppose as framed by the Department of Just Shut Up and Dribble, the question might be, do athletes give up their rights of protest when they put on a uniform? It turns out, though, that the issues can't really be constrained in that way. The intersection of race and sports and law is considerably more complicated than Trump's attack on Colin Kaepernick, crucial as that obviously is. And there's nothing new about this, of course. In fact, my wife, Donna Scarborough, over dinner reminded me that it's now exactly 50 years since Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised the Black Power symbol at the Olympics in Mexico City, and the kind of demonization that went on when they did that. At a minimum, our topic tonight, I think, invites us to think about how the history of sports in America is inseparable from and symptomatic of the history of race in America. And thinking even more broadly, the topic invites us to think about some of the most volatile elements in American society today, not just the construct of race, but also the power and the limits of the law to assure justice or to reform this society. We could even use this topic, I suppose, to dig into the real meaning of patriotism or the law and culture of free speech in this society in a variety of settings. And although it's not explicitly in the title, we may find ourselves drawn to related issues of gender and gender identity, patriarchy and misogyny, or wealth and class. Those aren't out of bounds according to our topic. And at some point, we won't just be talking about the rights of professional athletes. We have to talk about amateur athletics and the concern that amateur athletes are being exploited by the NCAA and its member institutions. And maybe we'll even have an opportunity to think together without necessarily agreeing. We'll have a chance to think together about the elements of good parenting when it comes to sports and race, including, I suppose, the optimal role of sports in our local schools. And in my own opinion, our title and the diverse community both in this room and immediately outside of this room, that diverse community in our title really obliges us to consider and discuss these issues in more than the two-dimensional terms of black and white. I can't imagine two better guides or experts or provocateurs for this evening than Ethelbert Miller and Jeremy Duru. Of the many possible formats for structuring our conversation tonight, the structure that seemed best to the organizers and to the participants was first to invite our two speakers to address you free form for about 8 minutes each, letting them set the stage for the conversation in any way that they think best. I will keep time gently, but relentlessly. 8 minutes is 8 minutes. And after those opening comments, I'll pose a few short questions and then get out of the way. And we'll reserve about 25 minutes near the end for questions and comments from the audience. So, we probably should have done the sports thing and had a ceremonial flip of the coin between here in the middle of the stage to see who goes first. But in the exercise of the only authority I have on this stage, I'm going to go alphabetically by last name and ask Jeremy to get us started.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ralph, and Pat and Meryl and everybody else involved. This really is a privilege and honor, and very special for me. I grew up, as was mentioned, just up the street on Piney Branch Road, and went to the schools that surround this building, both Takoma Park Elementary and Piney Branch. And I did play football in front of the library. And quietly, I've always assumed that they planted the trees to get us out of there. Those trees didn't used to be there. It used to be open. We played. Now the trees are there. But it really is an honor to be here. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity to sit here and talk with these two esteemed gentlemen to my right. You know, I probably won't take the entire 8 minutes. I think because I really wanted to move on to the questions and the conversation. I'll say that I have an interest in this stuff. I do love sports. I grew up loving sports. But my interest in it has become far deeper as I've grown, because I've really begun to see sport as a societal tool. Nelson Mandela used to talk a lot about the strength of sport to unite, the power it has to unite, the power it has to push societies in progressive directions. Of course, it also has the power to divide, and sometimes does, but I think its power to unite is greater, and so I study it. And I think our history is replete with examples of this. And just walking back, the beginning of the previous century, or I guess a quarter of the way into it, when you think about Jesse Owens and the 4 gold medals that he won, very few people probably know what events he won them in, but most people probably know that he won them in 1936 in Berlin. As his very participation, not to mention success, was a thumb in the eye of Hitler and his ridiculous theories. And then you move forward in history a bit and you see the integration of professional football, National Football League, and Major League Baseball in this country. And most scholars will say that certainly there were people who were far more involved in and responsible for the great seismic shifts we had with respect to racial tolerance and racial justice in this country in the middle part of the previous century. But there's no question that the symbolic gain of being able to desegregate major sports institutions meant something. It provided the idea that if maybe we can play on the same fields with each other, then perhaps we can live in the same apartment complexes and neighborhoods and work in the same offices and go to the same schools. And so you began to see some of the great court decisions and legislation that worked to unravel the segregation that had gripped us. And then you move forward, and Ralph mentioned gender. I mean, the same principles at play there. Billie Jean King in her tennis career did more for gender equity in this country than 100 politicians could have done. And what she did with the WTA, Women's Tennis Association, both as an organizer and as an athlete. And it's global as well. Meryl is an international human rights lawyer. In 1995, when South Africa was teetering on the brink of a bloody civil war after the apartheid regime was overthrown, the nation hosted the World Cup of rugby. And at that World Cup of rugby, they won. And what was important was that Nelson Mandela asked the entire nation, he was just the new president, asked the entire nation to embrace the South African rugby team, which prior to that, had been a symbol of apartheid oppression. Black people in South Africa hated rugby. They didn't watch rugby. They didn't think about rugby. They certainly didn't cheer for South Africans playing rugby. But Mandela insisted that these were not white South Africans playing rugby. These were our fellow South Africans playing this game and representing our nation here on home soil. We have to rally around them. And the nation did rally around them. And they ended up winning. And black and white celebrated in the streets afterwards in a way that they really hadn't before. Now, it wasn't perfect, and South Africa wasn't perfect then. It's not perfect now. But without question, I think Mandela would have said before he passed away, may he rest in peace, that sport was a big part of, at the time, saving the nation. And so because sport has this power, I feel like it's critical to embrace it and to explore it, which is one reason I'm so happy that we've got this conversation going tonight. And what's most interesting, I think, about the context is that for years, there was tremendous activism in sport. And then as the 70s wore on, it kind of melted away. And throughout the 80s and much of the 90s, there was very little activism in sport. And over the course of the last 6, 7 years, it's blown up again. And so we're now in a place where we're beginning to see activism in sport, and as a consequence are in a place where we can try to harness that activism and use it as a tool to strengthen society. And I think probably all of us in this room, although I guess I don't want to presume, would agree that we're in a political place right now where we can use all the tools that we can get to strengthen and unite our society. So I'm very happy to be here. I look forward to hearing Ethelbert's comments and engaging this conversation.
Thank you so much, and you came in 2 minutes under, which means there are a lot of people out there who aren't lawyers. Some are lawyers and won't admit it. Some are recovering lawyers, would be my guess. Can you give us a minute and a half on what sports law is? Okay,
sure. So sports law, well, there's debate about what it is.
Okay.
It's actually...
and I see our time is up.
Right. I co-author a sports law casebook, and the first chapter is what is sports law. And generally, scholars agree that it is essentially various realms of sport as applied, or various realms of law, excuse me, as applied in the sports context. So antitrust in sport, and labor in sport, and collective bargainings, bargaining agreements in sport, and personal injury, and employment and labor in sport. And so it ends up being kind of a survey of the law as applied to sport. But there are realms of the law that are particularly relevant to sport. For example, there are employment discrimination statutes that prevent discrimination based on all sorts of categories, including race, that people have attempted to bring to bear in the sporting context, and they've not, there hasn't been the sort of adhesion you'd hope. And maybe later on, I think you mentioned, Ralph, that we might talk about where there might be legal remedies and where there might not be legal remedies with respect to racism in sport. Maybe we can talk a little about the statutes.
Great. Thank you. Ethelbert.
What I'll do is read a short statement and then read one poem. Our lives are touched by sports. It begins when we touch a bat, ball, or glove. It begins when we touch water and swim, or touch earth and run. Many of our heroes are sports figures. Cities define themselves by teams. Could anyone find Green Bay on a map if it wasn't for the Packers? At times, it seems sports is almost a religion. For many years, one could understand Buddhism by listening to a Cubs fan. Sports is a poor man's nationalism and a rich man's attempt at ownership. Our history is often defined by men and women beating the odds. Our fantasies now revolve around sports, the way it once revolved around sex. Talk about race and sports, and it can be ugly and beautiful. How does one explain the sport of American lynching, or the racist chants at soccer games in Europe? What makes us proud to be human are those pages in history that introduce us to Joe Louis, Jesse Owens, Jackie Robinson, or Muhammad Ali. What encourages us to change history is Hank Greenberg, Jeremy Lin, Billie Jean King, or every young woman who emerges on the world stage during the Olympics. Sports, however, is how we make money. Sports is a business and not just a game. Sports destroys our bodies. And winning can become a cancer even while we might believe losing is a disease. Sports is how we measure manhood and how we are forced to open our eyes to womanhood and sisterhood. We change the rules of sports because sports for many is simply entertainment. We want our sports fast and not slow. We want our sports figures to shut up and dribble. We support prayer, but don't want players to kneel. All my life, I've struggled to understand cricket. I just don't get it. And I'm West Indian. Even my love for CeeLo James didn't help. I remember the one day my father didn't have to work. It was a Sunday, and instead of going to church, he took me and a basketball to the park. I was happy it was a Sunday because my father made a fool of himself. He didn't understand the game, and he couldn't play. It would be years later that I would understand it was his silent way of letting me know how much he loved me. On that day, I learned the home was more important than the court. In 1968, I moved to Washington, D.C. from the South Bronx. Washington, D.C. is where my children were born and their children. Sports helped define my fatherhood. My children's achievements provided me with a way to measure their character. I watched how their skills develop. I observed their relationship with teammates and opponents. I watched my children deal with victory and defeat. Both my son and daughter pushed themselves in ways that reminded me of my father going to work day after day, even when he was sick and not feeling well. I recall my daughter in 2005 running the last miles of the Marine Marathon, injured but pushing herself to finish. I remember sitting on the bed next to my son when he was the captain of his high school basketball team. His body, he told me, felt very old, his back hurting him to the point it was difficult to sleep or walk. There is something about sports that even poets cannot explain. We search for metaphors. At the end of the day, however, it is sports that can define beauty, the tight spiral or the high arc of a Curry 3. It is sports that teaches us how to cheer, how to love, how to understand what it means to be human. And this is where we find the intersection between race, gender, and sports. We struggle every day to reach King's beloved community. We struggle to create an equal playing field. The rules of our games must be fair for all. And I thought I would read a poem. I know the Red Sox won the World Series. And for some reason, and this gets into race in our neighborhood, at times you would think we live in Boston because there's so many B hats. You know, like, I don't get it. My introduction to the Red Sox was Pumpsie Green, and I have Pumpsie's Green baseball card. And Pumpsie Green was the first black player to play for the Red Sox. And the Red Sox was the last team to integrate. But I like Pumpsie Green because my name is Ethelbert. We have something in common, those names. Pumpsie Green. Years before we decided to change our names and name ourselves, I held your baseball card in black hands and wondered, who gave you the name Pumpsie? How unforgettable, as if Nat King Cole had decided to sing your name. You were the first black player to play for Boston. I wondered about the ear's loneliness when you got a hit or the error someone made when you calling you to bunt and run. How green was the Fenway Field before your arrival? Your name assigned against segregation, finally finding a place in the locker room. Pumpsie Green. What Red Sox fan mistook your last name for being Irish after being puzzled by your first? Thank you.
I think I want to become a poet.
Now, I told my daughter to become a lawyer.
Poets being the unacknowledged legislators of the world, you can have both. You know, this program suggested itself to the organizers, again, when President Trump started attacking the NFL players. And I wonder if we can start there with your initial thoughts about whether we expect more. We expect more silence from athletes than we do from musicians or from artists. Why, or do we tolerate less political speech from athletes than musicians or movie stars? And if so, why is that? Is there anything to the argument that sports is finally, at the end of the day, a place of respite from the kind of infantile and violent politics in which we find ourselves? Is there an argument that says when you put on the uniform, don't offend?
I think it begins, and the players would say this over and over again, it begins with the issue, what were the players protesting? You know, that pretty much gets lost. You know, they would respond in the way any person here who's a parent would respond in terms of if their child was shot by the police. So you deal with that issue. It's not a general thing. But then you also deal with the fact that we sometimes confuse, you know, the game with the patriotism, you know, and the singing the national anthem. The other thing to bring in is the fact that when we are watching these games, especially on television, you know, and you're a young male, you know, you're getting these ads that, you know, for the military and, you know, for the beer and the pizza and all that stuff. What I didn't know until this recently was how much money I think the NFL gets from the Defense Department. Yeah. You see, and that's an interesting relationship. And I think that what happened, we reduced this thing in terms of the flag and the troops and the things of that sort, and overlooked the issue which was dealing with what the players were protesting initially.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say, to go back to the kind of the first question you posed, Ralph, I think that a lot of people wish that there wouldn't be protests in sport. I think people view sport as an escape, as a fantasy. You know, you've had a really hard day at work, and things in your regular life aren't going that well, but it's Monday Night Football, and so you get to just relax and sit back and observe. So I think a lot of people would rather we not have politics or protests in sport, but I don't think we can afford that luxury. I feel because sport provides the tool that it does, which I described earlier, I think that it is incumbent upon us to harness it and to use it. And to those who would suggest that it shouldn't be used, I would respond that, you know, these athletes are not, you know, I think one thing that's commodified athletes in a way they were never commodified before is fantasy sports. This idea that you can run a team, these players belong to you. I don't know if folks know the concept of fantasy sports. You get a bunch of, we'll take football players on your quote-unquote roster. They're really players in the National Football League. And you get to control who plays, and if they score points and you end up winning, there's a sense that these players belong to us, which is really, really damaging. But I think it's possible to think that way when it's the case that we view these athletes as these kind of unthinking, single-track, monolithic, inhuman characters who go out and do these things, and then they disappear until the next week when they do them again. And if we think about people in that way, then of course they shouldn't protest. They should do nothing but play. But they're human beings, and they have every right to protest. And I think at this point in our history, we've seen the power of it, and that they should protest if they so desire, as you know, as so many are currently.
And then I would also add that the President of the United States is a failed football owner. And so what happened is that, you know, he comes out of this thing in terms of, you know, owning players and owning teams. And the fact that he failed at it, still realized that, like many of the football owners that we see, and I'll say the Dallas Cowboys, that team especially has some problems with the ownership. But what happens is that, you know, people carry over their habits and their views based on previous jobs that they've had, okay? And so what happens, you know, don't look at Trump as some sort of like, real estate, things of that sort, hotels and stuff. Look at him in terms of a football owner. And I think one of the best articles during the campaign was in the sports section, I think, of the New York Times, and what happened with the New Jersey Generals, and his feud with some of the other owners. I think that's the backdrop behind this also.
If we focus in on why these particular football players are kneeling and what they are protesting, and the racial injustice and in particular certain police practices that have a disproportionate impact on black men, does that mean that our feelings about protesting athletes actually change depending on what they're saying? So that in this case, especially in this room, in this community, we're very likely to think, of course, Colin Kaepernick is right. But how do we feel about someone who, I don't know, might be a professional football player who takes a stand against Hillary Clinton in the campaign?
I think what we see now, many people have their brand, and this is what's happening with social media. This is why, Steph Curry and LeBron James can go up against Donald Trump, because they have as much influence as others, And what happens now, I think many of these athletes who had Michael Jordan's picture on their wall also realized some of the statements that he made, in some of the previous elections, that they're not going to be like him. Okay, they are going to take a stand. I always laugh in terms of one of the players who took a stand against Michael Jordan, and then he sort of disappeared from the Chicago Bulls bench. That was Craig Hodges. All of a sudden he was very critical of Michael Jordan while he was on the team, and all of a sudden you saw that he was at the end of the bench and then out of the league. But I think what happens now that many of these players are socially conscious. The other thing that we have to look at, and this begins with the NBA, we saw this merging with basketball and hip hop. Okay, and so you can't have political hip hop lyrics and players listening to that. And I remember when Magic Johnson had to take somebody's, headset off because when he was coaching the Lakers, because they got their music stuff and going. But that's what they're listening to, and it's not just a beat; it's politics. Okay, and to some extent, especially the NBA, it has fused with hip hop. And so the same way you would say, okay, some of these lyrics I have problems with, this is what the athletes are listening to.
I hear brains out there turning. They're kind of going squirk it, squirk it, squirk it like gears. And they're thinking, what if the lyrics are misogynistic?
That comes with it too. What happens is that we live at a time in which all these issues have come to the forefront. Domestic violence, all these issues are now visible, okay? What happens now, we have everyone, with cell phones and stuff, and it's documented, okay? And so what happens now, this has been happening, but how now we have a responsibility in terms of how do we respond to it. In my opening comments, I made a brief reference to King's beloved community. I always do that. The whole thing about the beloved community is that if you don't see it, you struggle to bring it into existence. And so all these issues that we see playing out, and I'm glad we're here on this thing in terms about sports law, because I have been telling people, if you want to talk about our society, look at sports law in terms of issues of labor and jobs and workers' rights. The players never wanted artificial turf.
Jeremy, you want to respond to the observation?
Yeah, I think I would agree. I mean, just so people know the reference Ethelbert was making, if you don't, Michael Jordan was almost, at least he articulated, quite an agnostic approach toward anything that had anything, that could be deemed the least bit controversial. And he once, I think, famously said something to the effect of, when it may have been Jesse Helms,
sneakers,
when Jesse Helms down in North Carolina, the longtime racist politician down there, made some sort of comment, and Michael Jordan wouldn't come out and oppose it. He said, "Hey, Republicans buy sneakers too," was his response. And so that was Michael Jordan was kind of the middle of the period of hibernation we had with respect to activism in sport. And Ethelbert's reference was, well, now you've got folks who enjoy watching him play as an athlete, but the LeBron James of the world, Chris Pauls of the world are much more activist than those folks. But to go to your initial question, I think that, and with respect to what if the protests were about something else, I think that any sort of hate-filled or racist articulation of protest should be dealt with like any other workplace a rage-filled diatribe would be dealt with, which is that it wouldn't be accepted. But in terms of peaceful protest, if people want to peacefully protest in the other direction, peaceful protest, let's say for the thick blue line or whatever, for police.
Blue Lives Matter.
Yeah, Blue Lives Matter. The police are the ones who are really endangered here, not the black lives. Well, that's fine. If they want to make that protest in sport, that's fine. I think ultimately the market will bear it out. Who knows? Maybe we'll have a team out of, the Chicago White Sox become the very liberal-minded activist team, and the Denver, team becomes the team that's deemed to be quite conservative, and maybe the fan bases follow.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that we should have viewpoint discrimination with respect to who can and who can't protest in sport. I think everybody should be offered the opportunity to protest in sport.
In light of that, one place where I would like to see more protests would be around how much women in WNBA are being paid. Because they're not being paid anything. This is why some of them you look up, are going over to Europe to play. But when you look at how much a guy is making in the NBA and how much these women are making, I know the season's shorter, but they're not getting the endorsements. Okay, I remember as soon as Cheryl Swoops, for example, came out and said she was a lesbian, she totally disappeared. And then no one complains about the loss of some of these franchises, like the Houston Comets don't exist anymore. And that was opportunity for more women to play the game after college. And I think there's a place to protest.
Can I chime in on that one, Ralph?
Please.
Because I think this is the area where law can come to bear. So I was actually doing research on this the other day, Ethelbert, actually, and it turns out that the minimum NBA salary is above $500,000 a year, well above now. The maximum, it's capped, WNBA salary is in the low 100s, maybe $120,000, $130,000 a year. But there's something even worse than that. And that is that in order to play in the NBA, the threshold is that you have to be 1 year out of high school. And they're talking about reducing that to no years out of high school. You can come straight from high school. In the WNBA, the threshold is 4 years out of high school. You have to be 4 years out of high school before entering the WNBA. Now, the NBA and the WNBA are part of the same organization. The WNBA is a partially held subsidiary of the NBA. So what that equates to is a league with two divisions, a men's division and a women's division. In the men's division, you can play when you're 19, basically. In the women's division, you can't play till you're 22. Elite athletes might have 10 good years in them before they start to go downhill. So you're losing 30% of your opportunity to be an elite athlete just because you're a woman. It's wrong. I think there's a statute called Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that could be brought to bear right now if there was a plaintiff who wanted to challenge the WNBA. And if there is, let me know, because I've been looking. This is a case I've been looking to bring for some time.
Is there some provision in their contract that prevents them, probably not this explicitly, but that prevents players from protesting or from exercising speech on the court, on the field, on the diamond? I mean, it won't be anything like, thou shalt not speak of things political.
Right.
But I can imagine a provision in the contract itself that says you won't bring ill repute on the team,
Absolutely.
or you won't embarrass
There
the
is,
team.
yeah, absolutely.
What is that? What's the legal dynamic of that contractual limitation?
Sure. So the provisions that you're referencing in different leagues have different names. In baseball, it's called the best interest of baseball clause. In football, it's called the conduct detrimental clause. And these are incidentally not contracts individually negotiated between players and clubs, but the collective bargaining agreement that the entire players union negotiates with the entire league. And those agreements, which bind all players on all clubs in each of the leagues, say basically that if you engage in conduct detrimental to the NBA or the NFL or its image, you can be penalized, whether with suspension or fine or whatever. So of course, what's the question? What qualifies as conduct detrimental? And it's a subjective test, and under different commissioners in the different leagues, the commissioners are the individuals who basically run the league, like the president of the league. Under different commissioners, those clauses, the best interest clause in baseball, the conduct detrimental clause in football, have been interpreted in different ways.
This is where investigative reporting comes in, and one of the things I've always done in my life is undertaking probes. maybe that's the poet in me. One thing I would be interested in knowing, when women's basketball, especially overseas, before the WNBA was created, how many young women might have been forced to have abortions so that they could continue playing? I just wondered where they had to make that decision in terms, okay, I just learned I'm pregnant. If I tell that, I won't be able to play. There's no coverage after, and all of a sudden, they're forced into having an abortion just so that they can play. That's just something that, if I was looking at something to explore and investigate, it might be interesting to see that.
And it's not, I'm sorry, Ralph.
No, please.
It's not, that's not an entirely rare circumstance, sadly. And at some point, Ralph mentioned that we may get into amateur athletics, and if we do, we can talk
Just
about
about
it
to
more.
do
But there, the same dynamic comes to bear among women who have collegiate scholarships and are worried about losing their scholarship, athletic scholarship, because they become pregnant. And if it's not a situation where women choose to get an abortion because of that, women often play late into their pregnancies, hiding their pregnancies, wrapping their bellies to avoid being noticed as pregnant, and obviously, as a consequence, endangering their health and the health of the child.
You've anticipated just where I wanted to go after talking about professional sports. Let's talk for a minute about amateur sports. Jeremy, you've written, some have referred to collegiate sport as a plantation, in that athletes are prohibited from being paid while coaches, athletic directors, conference commissioners, et cetera, make hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars annually. And I guess the question is that an accurate description? We know we hear it. The question is, how accurate is it? And the question would be, I suppose, for both of you, should we abandon the NCAA amateurism model and pay the market rate for these people who are bringing in millions of dollars for their institutions? And are you at all concerned that whatever replaced the amateur model might be a cure that's somehow worse than the disease? Is that something we should be?
Well, I would answer this in terms of 40 years at Howard University. When you look at the relationship between universities and the sports program, we know, and we could go back to the Sampson Ewing era, that helped University of Virginia, that helped Georgetown. If you look at USMBC, or even George Mason, you have your school shows up in the NCAA, money comes in, enrollment goes in, and so there's a connection there in terms of money. Look at some of the Division A on schools in terms of how much are the coaches making. Okay, so even before we get to the athletes being paid, we can see this is a money-making thing for a lot of other people, as opposed to somebody shows up their freshman week, And so I think that's the bigger picture someone needs to look at. I would just add this in terms of being, a personal response. My concern with the amateur is not necessarily about money and things of that sort, but about health issues. When I look at what my son encountered on the college level, I was happy he didn't go to the next level because the bodies were going to be bigger. Okay, but what happens? You injured in college, and sometimes you don't get that medical attention and treatment, and all of a sudden you look up, your body is damaged for the rest of your life, and so and there's no money can compensate for that.
Yeah, I would say that the description that you offered is apt. I think for the most part, there are. It's a bit more complex than just thinking about college athletics. There's Division I, Division II, and Division III. Division III has no scholarships, and really there's no revenue being brought in. Division II has some scholarships. There's some revenue being brought in, but not much. Division I, most schools don't bring in revenue, but many, of course, do. And when they do it principally through basketball and football. So it's a complex question, and we may have to parse it out. I actually have my students break into small groups and talk about how we sort through the potential of paying players. Should the quarterback of the football team get paid the same if we're going to start paying players as a reserve on the golf team? Should the quarterback on the football team, starting quarterback, get the same as a reserve player on the football team? I don't know the answer to those questions, but I do have an answer to your question as to whether the amateur concept should melt away, and I think the answer is yes. It really is an exploitative experience that these individuals endure, and I don't think it's tenable, and quite frankly, I don't think it's ethical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What would you replace it with? That's the part where we're not quite sure.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I think there are a couple of ways to think about that. What would you replace it with, assuming an NCAA still exists? I'm not sure. That's the piece that I have my students talk about, and it'd be hard to sort out exactly who gets paid and doesn't get paid. But there's a possibility the NCAA crumbles altogether. And the NCAA being the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the regulating body of collegiate athletics. I was talking to an individual who started an organization you may hear about soon called the Historical Basketball League. And he feels the NCAA is horribly exploitative, and he wants to create a revenue producing entity that replaces it. And his model is that in 12 cities across the country, cities where there are universities, he would set up teams. And if you were on one of the teams, basketball, it's just basketball in his vision, if you're on one of the teams, you have to go to school at an institution in that city. It can be a trade school, it can be a community college, it can be a college, it can be a university, but you have to go to school, so you have to be in school. And if you're going to school, then the league will pay you a salary. So you get to be a student. The one piece we haven't talked about is, are student athletes really even allowed to be students? But under this model, you get to be a student. The basketball league is played during the summer, so you're not having 10-hour road trips and missing exams because you're playing during the summer, and you're getting paid, and you're being a student. And after you finish playing there, you can go to the pros just like someone who plays at an NCAA institution. So that's one model, but there are any number of them. If we can break free of this NCAA yoke that I think we sit in under.
But look at that,
think
okay? If you look at it from the media standpoint, you've got these summer games in the middle of the baseball season. You don't have the March Madness. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, right. No. I mean, there's no question that there would still be some folks who would want to, play, the NCAA schedule. But the summer's thick. You've got baseball, that's true, but the WNBA plays over the summer, and so there seems to be desire for basketball over the summer.
But there's the issue. You don't really see it promoted.
The WNBA? Yeah, but I think that has to do with patriarchal and paternalistic concerns more than the possibility of people watching basketball over the summer. Now, I got to tell you, I love baseball, Ethelbert. But
you're not just saying it because you're on the stage.
No, I love it. No, I love it.
He's already done to play Red Sox, so.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of baseball. But sadly, for those of us who are fans of baseball, it does not garner the attention that it once did. And particularly interestingly, and we may get to this, in the black community. Baseball used to be played by a lot of black kids, and now it's played by a few black kids. My son is one of them. Both of my sons have played, and they're usually one of maybe 2 out of 12 black kids on the Little League team.
But see, that's what I challenge you on that. We're so accustomed to this model that the black player, it's a black English-speaking player.
Black American.
Right, exactly. But
now.
That's key because we struggle. I remember back in the '70s when we were all Pan-Africanists and dealing with the diaspora. We're all African people. It is a thing where we have to become aware that someone could be like a black Cuban. We have this thing that all Cubans look like the old Fidel Castro, but no. When you get into these countries, you realize they've got their Mississippi and and that's part of history that many times we don't learn. And then through the media, it's perpetuated that way. All of a sudden somebody can't say someone's name, and that's a sort of racial bias also. But I think that when we say there's not enough black players, it's specifically not enough African American players, and it's English speaking. That's why I like what Jeter's doing down in Miami Marlins, encouraging the entire organization to learn Spanish. Okay, and so I think that for us on the stage, we changed that by saying, black players, and then we make sure that people know it's not necessarily African American players. And sometimes we're talking.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And now you talked about black Cubans, and now of course it's principally black Dominicans. But I totally understand that. Yeah. But I was talking about a different dynamic, which is why African American black kids have stopped playing baseball and are playing basketball more than they used to.
Well, if it was 1950 and I was a black kid and I saw Willie Mays playing stickball with me, I mean, I would maybe want to play baseball, The other thing one could look at, and I grew up in the South Bronx, you could look at what happened to the inner city during the crack epidemics, what happened to playgrounds and things of that sort. Someone would say, okay, you have to have X number of kids to play baseball, I mean, I could shoot hoop with 2 or 3 people, right? So just that, is a key. The other thing I think we might want to add in terms of we're talking about college and also even before that, maybe even AAU teams and stuff like that. There might be some people out here in the audience. The cost to sometimes to send your child who begins to excel to the camps and the tournaments, there's a cost there. And some families just can't afford that.
Yeah, no, it's a huge, actually, for those of you who are really interested in this sort of stuff, there's a show called Real Sports with Brian Gumbel on HBO, which is, in my view, the best sport and society show that exists. And this past episode they had, it came out last week, was about youth sports and cost. Mm-hmm. And it's extraordinary how much it costs to play youth sport. And many, Takoma Park Rec Department is still in good stead, but many rec departments have given up on sport. And so it's left to the travel teams, and you're going to be on the travel team, you have to pay $1,000, per half year, per season, and a lot of kids aren't able to do it. And so what you've got is more and more kids who are affluent and fewer and fewer kids of color who are playing youth sports in this country.
That's the perfect segue, I think, to thinking about sports and parenting. You've both talked a bit about your children and the role of sports in their lives and your own parenting techniques. You've been actively involved in the sports lives of your children. And I guess the question would be, so what advice or what cautionary tales can you share about enabling all of our children to thrive in what I think we have to say is a sports-obsessed culture? Do our schools privilege sports over other types of achievement? And if so, how would we go about changing that? Is that something that we should be in mind? Are we concerned that the great basketball and football players get all of the attention, but the great cellists or the great spirit or the great cooks or the great writers, the great readers really don't? So I guess it really 2 kinds of questions. What advice or cautionary tales can you offer parents who are thinking about bringing their children into sports, not just sports obsessed, but race obsessed? But also, what do we need to do at the school level, in your opinion, to make sure that everybody is honored?
I'll just mention 2 anecdotes, and I look at my son and my daughter. My daughter's 36. We're a sports family, and so I'm happy about that, especially in terms of my daughter, because what happens, she's a lawyer, and what happens for many women, when you're in those little offices and stuff like that, like a Monday night, well, she can talk sports, there's like Condoleezza Rice, you know what I'm saying? Women who know the game. And I felt, that it was just so important for a young woman moving into some of these fields, because, that's bringing up that old boys network. You just can't have that locker room talk if you have a woman who's been in the locker room, So I was happy to see that. With my son, I raised my son to be a basketball player, and that was the thing. We say, well, everybody's not going to go to the NBA. No, I raised my son to master the game of basketball, and it was the fact that we were a poor family. I said, well, Jasmine, we can pay for her. You're going to have to earn your way. We were breaking it up. So people know when I was in Adams Morgan, they would see us 5 o'clock in the morning, going to the basketball court. But what happened is that I was fortunate to have someone, and this is like winning the lottery, what we see with getting these schools. Someone saw my son playing not far from here on the playground and thought he was that good and said, hey, we want to transfer you from this school to Gonzaga. And that changed his whole life, But what happened with the people around my son going to these tournaments, they were able to tell me, they said, Ethelbert, your son is one of the most brilliant kids in terms of the game. And my son is a head coach right now. He's just 30. He's the head coach up in New Jersey at 24. And I tell people that because that's the love of the game, okay? And he went into coaching at a community college, and it gets back to the parenting. You're a good parent when your child does things that you don't have to tell them. And I remember I was walking Columbia Road, and my daughter, she must have been 7 or 8, and she broke away from me and went and gave her little coins to somebody who was homeless. And I realized whatever I had been doing, this was good, okay? And I feel that my children learn that from sports, But as I said earlier, I felt they physically paid a price. They physically paid a price in terms that they were very competitive. And I'll end on this note. As a parent, and I wasn't a soccer, kick the ball type thing, and you can't give medals to everyone. You see, and we're like the Democratic Party right here. We want everybody under the umbrella and stuff. There's winners and there's losers. And Trump understands this, and I'll borrow a little bit of that for a minute. What happens, that's the thing where I always told my son and daughter how to win and how to lose with grace. How to win and how to lose. I don't want my children to be like the Detroit Pistons, and just walk past the Bulls because they want. I want that grace where, somebody embraces somebody, even in defeat. And that's what I felt the sports gives your children, more so than the trophies and things of that sort, And the character building is very, very important. And I can't think of anything other than maybe chess or something like that. I consider that a sport. Also that gives our children that sort of guidance and moral compass.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably a bit of a biased panel here. I also agree. Sports I think is critical. I think for a number of reasons. I agree. Winning and losing with grace. There are few better teachers in sport when it comes to that. Just being physically fit and appreciating a sense of athleticism as you get older, particularly in our society where obesity is a bigger and bigger concern. Experiencing failure, learning how to fail and get back up and keep going. All these values are values. Teamwork, cooperation, all these values are values that sport teaches. The concern I have, and Ethelbert's situation worked out well. His son got the opportunity to go to Gonzaga and go on, and he's now coaching. But a lot of people put all their eggs in the sports basket. And they decide early on that their kid is going to become a sports star, and as a consequence of that, get a scholarship and they'll get the free education. Well, first of all, not everybody's going to become a sports star, no matter how hard they try. Secondly, if they're saddled with that expectation and they don't do it, then here's mom and dad. Well, we spent $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 over the course of 12 years, and now we're not getting it back, and then there's some resentment there. And then it's hard. Even if you get a scholarship in sports other than football and basketball, it's almost certainly going to be a partial scholarship. And sometimes just a quarter scholarship, like a baseball team might have 8 scholarships for 25 kids, and they have to parse them out. But on top of that, a lot of people don't like being collegiate student athletes. I can't tell you the number of people I've come across who have said, it became business. It wasn't fun anymore. And so you may be raising your child to go into a situation that is, for many, a relatively uncomfortable one. So I strongly believe in sport, but with the end game of it being a character building and fun experience, not with the end game of it being a ticket to something else.
In fact, in your book, Advancing the Ball, you quote Johnny Cochran as saying that sports should exhibit and does exhibit the best values of American life. And I hear that in what both of you have said, but I also understand both of you not to be gilding the lily, or not to be sugarcoating this, but to recognize that there are genuine costs to the child, to the parent, to the culture, when sports are out of control. And as for chess, let me just tell you that I gave up competitive chess as my sport because I found I was homicidal towards my opponents. And it sounds...
And you're moderating?
It sounds funny now. It sounds funny now, but when I was 16 years old and I was testosterone poisoned, seriously, I wanted to beat them so badly that they would give up chess. That's testosterone poisoning. And I gave up the competition because I didn't want to live there.
Bobby Knight profile.
That's a toxic, and I'm just saying.
So you were self-aware enough to feel it and realize you had to get out?
Well, it took me, you got to feel really bad to feel that. So,
yeah, that's right.
Let's, it's a moderating experience. In a few minutes, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and I'm going to ask Pat to handle the microphone so people can be heard. The microphone is just now up on the podium. But let's make the transition by thinking about books. Here we are in Takoma Park's historic and treasured library. I guess 2 questions, and you should pick one. One question you could choose is, other than your own, what books about sports, fictional or otherwise, do you consider the most important or insightful, and why? But the other, and maybe the more interesting question is, what books about or involving sports are you aching to write next?
Well, I'll give me the titles because of, I'm a strong supporter of libraries. And then also, I'll just mention the names of sports writers who are in the area. One is Paul Dixon, who, Leo DeRocher, he's baseball encyclopedia, he's key. Another person is Larry Maffei, who lives in the area. One person who I see every week is Dave Zirin. He has this book out on Jim Brown. If you put Zirin's name and my name together, you'll find a very interesting 2-part interview that I did with him for my TV show, The Scholars. And in the second part, I asked him something that I had never seen him discuss, which we were discussing on this stage. I heard Zirin talk about the football players and this and that. I never heard him talk about his personal life and the raising of his children. And you hear him talking about that, and I thought that was very revealing. One book that I just read by a local sports writer is Tim Wendell's book, Fidel's Curve, which is a very good novel. And I use that as an example in terms of what I try to do is be motivated, inspired by sports, and take it into poetry, or take it into fiction. And so the Fidel's Curve is what would have happened if, Fidel Castro had been a Washington senator, and not a revolutionary. You could figure that out. But I just mentioned those names because those are local authors, and this is a very important city in terms of sports and sports writers.
What we know is Fidel would be last in the American League.
That's like a Russian embargo, or instead of an American one.
I don't know. I guess
What are you making to write?
Let me tell you about the books.
Okay.
I'll tell you about the books. So there are 3 books that I think that I'll mention, then I'll tell you what I'm making to write. So one it's called Hard Road to Glory by Arthur Ashe. And it's Arthur Ashe, in addition to being an extraordinary tennis player, is also an extraordinary academic. And he wrote this incredible history of the African-American athlete called The Hard Road to Glory. The next one is called $40 Million Slaves by Bill Rhoden, the New York Times columnist, which delves deeply. It's the authority on this issue of amateurism in athletics, as well as professional athletics, and the extent to which athletes end up, in many ways, being owned. And he has a lot to say. The book was written 15 years ago, but he has a lot to say in that book 15 years ago about what's going on right now with the protests and the attacks on the protests. And then third is a local author, and actually a family friend, named Jack Petrash, who wrote a book called Covering Home. And it's about how to parent using lessons from baseball. I don't know if you've read that book.
Yeah. Right, yeah.
Extraordinary book. And I've read it a couple of times. It's helped me a lot with my parenting, to be honest.
I gave that to my son.
Yeah, that's a great book. In terms of what I'm aching to write, I actually really want to engage youth sport and try to figure out how to get youth sport back on track, because it really has grown out of control. In addition to the things we talked about, and I know we want to get to the audience, so I'll just take another 30 seconds, but in addition to the things we talked about, young athletes are being, in some ways, forced to, certainly strongly incentivized to specialize in sport at the age of 7 and 8 years old. And so by the time they're 15, they've got overuse injuries. They're getting surgeries that used to be surgeries for grown adults who play sports. And it's all in the quest for this scholarship or for this athletic stardom. And it's just the entire youth sports complex has been turned on its head, and it's a real shame. And I'd like to see if I can attack that in some way.
Could I add something that gets overlooked sometime in terms of sports and injuries? I was always concerned also about injuries to young women who were cheerleaders. That was another area in terms of knees and things of that sort. But those are injuries that, I find that if you're a parent and your child is injured while playing like middle school, high school sports, you take it to the emergency room and the response is put ice on that, and you never know whether there's serious damage, You know, sometimes I always see a young woman who maybe is 28 or 27 with a little boots on. I said, oh, soccer injury, yeah, soccer injury. You know, it wasn't diagnosed early, but here it is, a woman's not even 30, and she's suffering from that. But I'm also concerned about, you know, cheerleaders who are thrown up in the air and somebody didn't catch them, you know, and to me that's a sports injury. And then there's another group of people not getting paid properly.
Yeah.
So we have about 20 minutes, and I think all of us on the stage would love to hear from the audience, whether it's questions or comments. I would ask you to limit your comments to 2 minutes.
And no punching.
No punching?
And punting.
No punting,
No
no
punching
punching,
either.
and no pointing. Please put your pens in your pockets. I'll call on people, and I think for the benefit of the folks at home watching on television, probably speaking into the microphone would be best. So, in the back, Pat?
Before I go, just say there are a couple of the books that were mentioned.
Use the microphone, Pat.
So a couple of books that were mentioned by the speakers, $40 Million Slaves, Dave Zirin, and Arthur Ashe, Days of Grace, his memoir, are all in the library. So check them out.
So, first question's in the back.
Yeah, I'm a big WNBA fan and also an NBA fan. And a question I have is, you know, the salaries in the NBA are so much greater than the WNBA, but isn't that a function of just business success? That there's such a demand to watch the men's game as opposed to the women's game? So that's one question I have, but the follow-up question is, does the NBA, since it's invested in the WNBA, doesn't the NBA have an affirmative role to publicize and market the WNBA and get it to be a more successful business?
Yeah.
You go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, great question. And I think that your final question bears on your first. That is to say, I think the NBA does have that responsibility. And quite frankly, if they believe in the WNBA and WNBA model, that incentive, right, to do it. But they haven't. So I don't know if you've noticed, if anyone read this, maybe you did, but the WNBA Players Association has opted out of their collective bargaining agreement. And so there will be a lockout or a strike before right after the 2020 season if a new agreement isn't entered. And one of their biggest, they've got a number of complaints. One of their biggest complaints is that the NBA has not invested enough in the league, in marketing the league. And I would say that the salaries of WNBA players are to some extent a reflection of the market, as you point out. But if properly marketed, if the sport, the game is properly marketed, then I think the market changes. And the market becomes more competitive and more people want to watch it, and you get better TV deals and more endorsements, and suddenly the salaries start to push up. So I think it's cyclical, and I think if the NBA invests more, then we've got a chance of decreasing the chasm between men's and women's salaries in professional basketball in this country.
And I would add about how they initially did the marketing. If you go back to that early Tina Thompson era and stuff like that, you saw a real attempt for them to market these women to emphasize how feminine they were. Okay, right. There was a push that these are feminine women. They don't want to have the little butch look. They want to play that down. I didn't know Rebecca Lobo was Latino until she had when she got injured and had cornrows. And she was never, promoted that she was Latino. You know, she was promoted like, okay, we need some white players, and so she was promoted that way. But it was interesting how there was always these little profiles of these women, and they want to do model, and they want to do this and that, and I said, well, who is that for? Okay, the same way you saw here in terms of, and Sheila Johnson made a change here with the Mystic. So in our era, we had a strong base, okay? What some people was concerned about, that base was very heavily lesbian. And what the complaint was is that when they had the little kiss, the camera go around, they never showed like a gay couple kissing. And they complained, and Sheila Johnson, because she's a woman, responded to that, but there was a separate bias. So here you're supporting the game, and what happens is that someone's saying, okay, we don't want this type of woman, playing. We don't want this type of woman even in the audience, and so they became invisible. Mm-hmm. And that's the type of packaging that I think when we talk about protest, you have to protest that.
Let's come over here to the front.
Patty.
I have a follow-up to your question about the WNBA. It is because of the different income levels, but there's a percentage difference, too. The men in the NBA earn about 50% of the money that's brought in by the NBA. The women earn about 20%. So even if you're talking the numbers are greater, the percentages can be, that can be solved. I'm glad to hear the ideas of men's sports that have a big audience focusing on the women and trying to get attention in women's sports. I'm a big fan of that. It's happening a little bit in hockey. I love to see it happen in baseball. My real question is actually about baseball minor leagues. You touched on it briefly about the pay or the lack of pay for the minor leagues. And I know there was something recently, I'm going to get all the legal terms wrong, but I believe that the minor league players were exempted for some minimum pay.
Mhm.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
Because I don't understand it completely, and I certainly don't understand why that happens.
Sure. So, Major League Baseball players basically make a minimum of $500,000 a year. Minor League Baseball players make a minimum of about $1,000 a month. They get paid poverty wages at the lowest. Now, as you get higher up, you get paid more, and the great stars who ultimately play in the minors for some period of time, they get big $1 million signing bonuses. So even though they're not making much on the wage, as a matter of wage, they've got these big bonuses. And so somebody who used to play in the minor leagues didn't make the majors, and was so angry with the way he was treated as a minor league baseball player with respect to the amount of money he made, he went out and became a lawyer because of this, and then brought a lawsuit. And it's the lawsuit that you're referencing. It's called SENNE, S-E-N-N-E, versus Major League Baseball. And the lawsuit alleged that the wages I just described are violations of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And the Fair Labor Standards Act requires a minimum wage and no more than 40 hours a week unless you get overtime pay. You may not know it was from that statute, but you're familiar with the concepts of minimum wage and the 40-hour week. There are some exemptions to it. There are exemptions if you are an executive. There are exemptions if you make more than a certain amount of money. So as a young practicing lawyer at a law firm, they could work me 80 hours a week, but they're paying me a salary, and they don't have to pay me extra above the 40 hours. So the lawsuit was progressing through the courts, and it was becoming very interesting to see what would happen. And Congress passed a statute. I can't remember what it's called. Something like the American Heritage Statute, Act, or For the Love of the Game Act, or some crazy act like that, which literally exempted minor league baseball players from FLSA prescriptions. So you're precisely right, and the statute sunk the case, and so there is at this point no relief for minor league baseball players who really are paid quite poorly.
Yes, the gentleman in the red vest.
What do you think about the Gymnastic Association, who's trying to go bankrupt now because of other lawsuits that's being brought about Larry Nassar?
Against Larry Nassar.
Against Larry
Against
Nassar.
Larry Nassar. You want to go? Or you wanna
I'm not gymnastic.
Okay. So what do I think about the Gymnastics Association?
Well, the association's trying to survive by going bankrupt and leaving all these people who are trying to sue them out in
you
the
mean
cold.
the legal mechanism. It's tried and true in this country, unfortunately.
Sometimes you get to be president.
Yeah, right. Sometimes you get to be president. I was about to say that. It is in my view. The bankruptcy laws were passed for a reason. They were passed for relief, but they are one of many mechanisms that have been manipulated to benefit those who seek a way around the rules that bind most others. And so you see it throughout society. I wouldn't be surprised if it does come to pass, and if in 7 years they don't somehow begin to bounce back.
The gentleman in the sweater in the front row.
I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how the different leagues have really dealt with the protest issue. So you've had the NFL really try and tamp down and shame players. for protesting. You've had the NBA, where an entire team came out wearing shirts saying "I can't breathe," and then really in Major League Baseball, as far as I can tell, a lack of protests that have gone on, and what the differences are behind how that has transpired.
I think some things begin, this is just me looking at this, has a lot to do with how games are televised. For example, unless it's a big game, we don't necessarily see unless it's a playoff game. In the NBA, you don't really see that in terms of players standing around and listening for the national anthem to be sung. So that's one of the things I find. Also, I think it has a lot to do with the commissioners and who the owners are. I felt that the NFL owns a little more conservative. I saw that around how they responded to the film Concussion. I think that if you look at that movie, and it shows you about these owners, and then we can compare that to the NBA and also baseball, you saw that from the opening scene, you could see that the Steelers must at least have gone along with this film, because they would show you a lot of the Steelers, up front. But when the negotiation took place, the cameras did not go into that legal thing. So if you brought the cameras in, then you would have to have people playing those owners, and you would really see where they stand on things. But I think sometimes you look up. Silver pretty much came after Stern. The key players who really bring the money into that league were very outspoken. So if you've got Steph Curry and LeBron James right out the bat taking a position, there's pretty much, you've got to follow them, okay? And I think what happens is that with baseball, I think the players have protested in interesting ways. I look at what happened in Houston right after Puerto Rico, after the World Series. You knew that the players were playing for Puerto Rico, and everybody got behind that, okay? I think in terms of with baseball, there have been some incidents, especially when Steinbrenner had the Yankees, and this was after 9/11, where you could really see the politics at that time, because there was even a movement to change from the national anthem to America the Beautiful. And in some places, you get up at the seventh inning stretch, but it never became a thing where it became a real issue. And I think it has a lot to do with how things are televised, and that's why somebody said, well, if the players just stay in the locker room or they stay off the field, it's okay. But then protest is never kind, and I think what happens is that I look at, once again, and this ties up, I guess, this program, sports figures wind up being heroic, and what happened, they speak out. And at the same time, people have to know their place in history. Some owners or commissioners understand their place in history, and they make decisions based on what we believe in terms of freedom of expression, the Constitution, and we respect that. But each sport, has a lot to do with how much money it brings in and who the audience is. If we don't really like baseball as much as football, well then, the football thing, people want to try to control that. And then I think football is pushed a lot more like the patriotism, for our country, America's team and stuff like that. You really don't find that in terms of baseball. Even though I end on this note, there is a connection between Steinbrenner, and people used to say that, between Steinbrenner and Trump. That if you were a New Yorker, Steinbrenner was on the front page, and Donald Trump was on the front page, Steinbrenner was on the back page. But it has a lot to do with these owners and commissioners, because they set the tone. But some players, like in the NBA, are just strong. If they want to protest, other players are going to follow. And this gets back to what we said there earlier. If Michael Jordan had done that, it would have been maybe we would have solved some of these problems earlier. But he would have paid a price, and maybe would not be as popular as it is today.
Jamie, did you want to?
I'll just say one thing. I really do think it has to do with commissioners and owners, as Ethelbert said. I think that NBA players have more confidence in their commissioner than NFL players do in theirs. I think NBA players feel like they are given the opportunity to express themselves in a way that NFL players aren't. And I think they're right about that. And I think consequence of that is that you don't have the anthem protests in the NBA, because in the NBA they've worn "I Can't Breathe" shirts. They've been vocal on social media. LeBron James in Miami, he took pictures with hoods over their heads, to protest the killing of Trayvon Martin, and the league didn't shout them down. And so when the league, I'm sure Adam Silver somewhere suggested quietly and softly, please don't please don't, sit during the anthem. And I think they've said, well, we have our other opportunities to protest. We don't need to do that. So I just think the NFL is, as a PR matter, handled it terribly. And I do think that the NFL owners, in addition to being more conservative, they tend to be older, and they do intend. There have been assessments of their political giving. They're far more Republican than are the NBA owners. So I just think it's a whole different.
Yeah. But there's one thing that did occur in baseball, which was very interesting. I remember Damon when he was on the Red Sox. The whole thing of hair. Okay. At one time, you had to be clean cut and stuff. The Red Sox sort of changed that, and that became an in thing. And people found out that you could package that. But you might recall some players were trying to protest, but the owners were saying, okay, if you come, if we trade for you and you come here, I think the Yankees were pushing that. You're gonna have Damon had to cut his hair. Okay. And that was a thing. As soon as players were protesting that, growing the hair, it's just like us growing afros, And here became, the politics of here could go back and look at how some of the leagues responded to that.
Especially for women.
Especially for women.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. Okay, we have time for two more questions. Let's go to Priscilla Levovitz in the front row.
Hello. I'm concerned about the pressures on kids who get athletic scholarships. I'm aware of friends of mine have sons, one of whom has a basketball scholarship at a middle school that is a feeder to Gonzaga. He's required to maintain, to get a good education. But the pressures on him, the traveling to play with other kids in the league are enormous. And of course, parents have to get them there. But the parents also have said to these kids, if you don't keep this scholarship, if you don't keep playing, you can't go to college. I feel like these young men are indentured. They don't have choices about it. It's not like the athletic scholarship is saving them. What do you think about that?
Well, I know is that if you look at Gonzaga and DeMatha, some of these schools, the pressure on just making the team it's really competitive, and it has a lot to do with, that point in your life, you try it out for the team. And, if you don't make like your high school team, that can be devastating for a young kid in terms of, whether it's tennis or football, whatever. Something happens right there. Sometimes, they could have been very good like in middle school, but now the next level, and that's sad. I mean, that's something that you really test your parenting.
Yeah, very sad. If I do write this book, I want to write. We can talk more about that particular concern, because it is very, very sad.
The last question belongs to the gentleman in the New York Yankees cap.
Speaking of baseball.
Speaking of baseball.
Thank you. First, let me just thank you, because this was a very interesting discussion tonight. Lots of topical, interesting issues, and I have tons of questions that I'd like to ask you. Given that we only have a few minutes, I will settle on one. You spent some time talking about the NCAA and whether players should be paid and so forth. First, let me ask, do you think, particularly with college basketball, when they get rid of, because at some point I think they will, get rid of the one and done rule, and kids can go straight to the NBA if they have the skill, do you think it'll lead to more players staying in college a little longer than they typically stay these days? I do think there's value, and I think part of the discussion around this misses the fact that there is value in achieving an education, and getting a scholarship and paying for college, particularly with the cost of college these days. There is a great value in that, and it seems we're missing that the players are getting something out of this deal. I'm not saying that it's an equal playing field, but it's not like a plantation. They are getting an opportunity to get an education and get a college degree.
Thank
What do you think about that?
Thank
Yeah,
you.
That's a great point. I'm glad you raised it. I think in the ideal circumstance, that is true. That's the way it should be, and in many places it is. I actually just got done litigating. I brought, in addition to teaching, I still bring cases from time to time, and I brought a lawsuit against the University of North Carolina, and I represented 4 student athletes, 2 football players, 2 women's basketball players. And it was a fraud, deceptive trade practices, breach of contract claim. And the argument basically was that the university came and recruited these athletes out of high school to go to University of North Carolina with the understanding that they'd be going to a great academic and athletic institution and have the opportunity to pursue what they wanted to pursue academically. And in the case of these 4 students, and it turns out students over the course of 18 years at the University of North Carolina, once they got to the university, they were told they couldn't study what they wanted to study. And they were forced to study a couple of different, focus on a couple of different majors, where they took non-rigorous courses and were really kind of passed along. So in that situation, it's the worst of the worst. You know, then it really is commodification and you're not getting an education. So I think we have to beware of those situations, and maybe because I was involved in that litigation, we lost, by the way, on statute of limitations grounds. We lost on technicality.
You just need new plaintiffs.
Right, we can't, but it's hard to find folks who are gonna buck major institutions. So that experience is fresh in my mind, and so I recognize the possibility of that scenario. But there is a scenario where there is a true education, and the university is committed to making sure that these student athletes are students as well as athletes. And when that happens, I feel much better about the construct.
And I would end on this in terms of, this might be helpful to anyone who's a parent in the audience. There is that realm of the small colleges that if your child really likes sports, they might be watching TV, they might want to go to the big schools and things of that sort. But I find that there are small schools that can provide that education, provide that sense of you're getting to play. You're not behind LeBron James. Well, he didn't go to college, but you're not behind somebody who's really good, and you don't get to play. But there's small colleges that sometimes you go and visit. My son went to Widener University. That was not his first choice. But, I remember going up there, and the coach, Duder, at that time said to us, as my wife and my daughter, we came together, he said, if you had sent your son up here on a bus by himself, we would never even consider him. And then he says, study comes first, and if he doesn't come to class, we will go across campus and get him. I looked at my wife, we said, this is where we're sitting here. So I just ended on that note that you can go to a small school and get a good education, enjoy what you like. And sometimes the smaller school, you get the classes are smaller, the teachers take a more interest in you, and it's just a wonderful atmosphere sometimes.
The mark of a great conversation, as far as I'm concerned, is one that you wish could just go on and on for a while. But we have a hard stop, and I have the feeling that this conversation and the issues that we've touched on will generate more conversation outside of this room in the weeks,
or
months,
income
and years
if you want to buy a book for $10.
Or income if you'd like to buy a book for $10. This is the kind of event that makes me so happy to be in Takoma Park, and I hope you will join me in thanking Jeremy Duru and Ethelbert Miller for a really splendid evening of thought.
And we will.
Thanks, man.
Well, thank you.